Susan Miller's heart pounded like a drum the moment she stepped into the courtroom, her hands trembling around the thin folder that held her only hope. Seated across from her was Robert Miller's formidable attorney, Jessica Anderson, who leaned in with a calculated smile and declared, "She's unfit. She can't even afford decent meals or a stable home for those children." In that instant, the sterile hush of the room felt suffocating, and Susan's world narrowed to two bright faces, Ethan, age 7, and little Grace, barely 4, waiting for their mother's strength to hold. Susan hadn't always been so fragile. Once, she'd thrived as a librarian, her days filled with stories and laughter. But after Robert convinced her to give up her career and manage the household, her independence slipped away like sand through her fingers. When he abruptly walked out, seizing their joint savings and leaving Susan scrambling for under-the-table cleaning jobs, she found herself in the free legal clinic before dawn, clutching receipts that chronicled late-night vigil by vigil hand-washing Grace's clothes in a cold bathtub, budgeting every cent and never missing a single rent payment. Now, as the judge's gavel hovered between mercy and judgment, Susan's fear threatened to overwhelm her, yet she refused to crumble for Ethan's sake. Little did anyone suspect that the real turning point would come when Ethan, brave beyond his years, quietly rose and asked permission to present a single folded letter one discovered in his father's safe that would upend every assumption and tip the balance back toward truth and justice. Susan's days began before dawn in her cramped 450-square-foot studio apartment on the outskirts of town, where the single radiator wheezed out heat like a tired old dog on a cold January morning. After pulling on her threadbare coat, one of 2 she owned, and filling a chipped enamel mug with coffee she'd budgeted down to pennies, she'd lace up scuffed sneakers and head out into the gray half-light to catch the bus. There was no time for breakfast. She'd already given the last of the cereal to Ethan and Grace, tucking their bowls away with a whispered promise she'd make it up to them later, by 7. She was cleaning offices downtown, armed with a spray bottle and a rag, wiping away the fingerprints and coffee stains that made other people's 9-to-5 lives tolerable. Between jobs, Susan kept a folding laundry rack in her bathroom, scrubbing Grace's tiny socks and Ethan's worn jeans by hand in the cold water that dripped from the faucet. She'd boil water on the stove 2 or 3 gallons at a time and mix it carefully so the children could have warm baths in the evenings. She knew the exact cost of every gallon of hot water. Having counted her quarters at the laundromat twice before choosing to pay for the rinse cycle, each load of laundry cost $3.50. And she sometimes skipped dinner herself so she could afford to wash their school uniforms before the next morning, when she wasn't at the downtown office towers or the laundromat. Susan worked evenings in a mom-and-pop diner 2 miles away. She'd serve plate after plate of hash browns and scrambled eggs, keeping her own stomach empty while chatting with patrons who never guessed how tight her own life was. She clipped coupons from the Sunday paper and clipped along the edges of clearance racks, searching for children's shoes that cost no more than $15 a pair. When she found a coat on sale for $20, she bought it immediately, knowing that Grace's preschool playground could be bone-chilling in the fall, and that Ethan's thin jacket would do little to keep out the wind. Bills arrived in neat white envelopes that she opened with dread. The gas bill was $67.42 this month. The rent had crept up to $820.30. She'd learned to trickle pay each creditor, sending what she could every week so no one noticed late fees piling up, and she'd never missed a payment on the apartment. Her landlord, Mr. Carlson, was a kind older man who looked the other way when her rent was 2 or 3 days late because he remembered how much she loved those children and how diligently she telephoned him to confirm her promise. Still, shame was her constant companion. She wouldn't let her own mother visit, too afraid her worn couch and the water-stained ceiling would invite pity instead of support. She didn't tell the free clinic lawyer that she sometimes went a full day without eating, drinking only water so she could afford the $4 bus fare back home. She did her best to smile when her children clung to her in the morning, asking if she'd read them another bedtime story the night before, all while her throat tightened with the knowledge she'd sometimes nod off before finishing the last page. Yet through every exhausting hour, each mop swipe, each wash and rinse, each dirty dish she hand-scrubbed without complaint, Susan kept her eyes on Ethan and Grace. She knew that stability wasn't measured by money in the bank, but by the warmth of a hug, the safety of a return home, and the certainty that their mother would be there no matter how hard the world pressed in. And though her fingertips bled from the cleaning chemicals, and her back ached from being on her feet 16 hours a day, she carried on because poverty was not a crime, and love was the only currency she'd ever trusted to see them through. Susan refused to let fear or shame keep her from fighting for her children. The morning of the hearing, she arrived at the county courthouse's free legal clinic before the sun was fully up, clutching a worn manila folder stuffed with every scrap of evidence she could find, faded receipts from the grocery store showing she'd stretched a $20 food stamp benefit into dinners for 3, a landlord's letter confirming she'd never missed a rent payment on her tiny 450-square-foot apartment, and grainy photos of Ethan and Grace eating boxed macaroni from paper plates because the dishwasher had broken weeks ago. She stood in line for nearly 2 hours, her heart hammering, hands trembling so badly that she nearly dropped the folder more than once. Inside the clinic, a volunteer attorney named Marcus Lee took one look at her tired eyes and ragged blazer and told her she was unlucky but not unworthy. He helped her organize her documents into clear bundles: living expenses, housing stability, child welfare, and coached her on how to speak without anger. Courts respect calm confidence, he said. Susan practiced her opening lines under her breath in the waiting room. Your Honor, I may not have a fancy lawyer or a large bank account, but I have shown up every day for my children. I have never missed a rent payment. I have never left their side. That afternoon, she walked into the courtroom carrying the very same folder, its edges dog-eared from overuse. She wore a simple navy dress, her only interview-appropriate outfit, and a borrowed blazer that smelled faintly of lavender. As she approached the bench, she felt the weight of dozens of polished legal briefs stacked on the other side for Robert's attorney. But she also felt something stronger than fear, unwavering love for Ethan and Grace. When the judge asked for her side, she laid out each packet calmly, describing how she juggled 2 under-the-table cleaning jobs at $12 an hour just to cover rent of $820.30 and utilities of $67.42 this month. She explained how she boiled water on her stove to mix with cold tap water so the kids could bathe, how she washed their laundry by hand in the bathtub because the laundromat's $3.50 per load fee sometimes forced her to skip dinner. Though her voice cracked once or twice, she stayed composed, refusing to let tears be used against her. She emphasized that despite her financial hardship, she had never let Ethan or Grace miss preschool, never allowed a utility shutoff notice to go unresolved, and never allowed their breakfast to be something less than nutritious, even if that meant eating only a plain bagel herself. Her detailed organization impressed the judge more than she had dared to hope. Each receipt and photo was a testament to her resourcefulness, her resilience, and her steadfast commitment to providing a loving, stable home. By the time she sat down, her back aching from standing so long, Susan knew she had given everything she had and, for the first time, believed that might be enough. The folder in her lap was no longer just a lifeline. It was proof that poverty is not neglect, and that a mother's determination can outshine the glossier evidence brought by deep pockets. Whatever happened next, she had shown up, stood firm, and honored her promise to Ethan and Grace that she would never give up on them, no matter the odds. The hush that fell over the courtroom the moment Ethan rose from his seat was so abrupt. It felt as though someone had yanked the breathing air from every lung. Susan Miller watched her son's small frame stand tall between the polished walnut benches, his 7-year-old face impossibly steady under the harsh glare of overhead fluorescent lights. Robert Miller's attorney, Jessica Anderson, had just finished presenting a litany of carefully curated spreadsheets and glossy photos of Robert's suburban 3-bedroom home, complete with manicured lawn and playroom toys that painted Susan as an unfit mother. At that moment, Susan's heart sank, certain the judge would side against her. But then Ethan cleared his throat and said, in a voice louder than his years, "Your Honor, may I show you something I found in my dad's safe?" Jessica's confident half-smile froze. Robert himself sat motionless, a stiff line forming around his mouth. The judge, mid-sentence, paused, eyebrow arching as he regarded the child. A murmur rippled through the gallery neighbors she'd invited, a social worker from the free clinic. Even the bailiff exchanged glances. Susan's throat went dry. She didn't know what Ethan intended to reveal, only that he held a folded piece of paper clenched in his palm like a lifeline. "Mr. Miller," the judge said slowly, extending a slender finger toward the bench. "If you have evidence you wish to present, please approach." With deliberate calm, Ethan walked past the rows of dark suits and down the center aisle, each soft tap of his worn sneakers echoing against the high-ceilinged room's marble floor. Susan felt her breath hitch as he reached the bench, met the judge's eye, and handed the envelope over with both hands, for a heartbeat. The courtroom was suspended in tension so thick you could hear the faint scratch of the judge's pen against his notepad. Then the judge unfolded the letter. His face, previously unreadable, flickered through confusion, shock, and finally something near indignation. He glanced up at Robert, who now shifted uncomfortably in his seat, beads of perspiration gathering at his temples. Jessica leaned forward, whispering urgently to her client, but her voice was drowned out by the silent power of that single document. When the judge cleared his throat, his voice carried the weight of sudden authority. "Mr. Miller, would you care to explain this?" Robert opened his mouth, but no words came. The judge held the unfolded paper toward him, typed instructions dated 3 months before the divorce filing, detailing how to conceal assets in offshore accounts, transfer funds to shell corporations, and artificially reduce reported income to undermine Susan's legal standing. It was a calculated strategy, a blueprint for financial deception written in cold, clinical language. Susan felt her chest tighten as the judge read aloud the most damning phrase, ensure minimal grounds for appeal by appearing financially stable and morally unimpeachable. The courtroom's collective breath released in one audible exhale. The jar of lists and charts that Jessica had believed would seal Susan's defeat lay forgotten. Instead, the truth lay exposed in those stark, unyielding lines. Even the bailiff leaned forward, as though drawn in by the gravity of the revelation. "Court will recess," the judge announced. "I am ordering an immediate inquiry into Mr. Miller's financial conduct. In the interim, primary custody will remain with Ms. Miller, and Mr. Miller's parenting time is suspended." Those words landed like a lifeline thrown into Susan's darkest moment. Tears she had clenched back since Dawn threatened to spill over, but she swallowed hard, reached out instinctively to tuck a stray curl behind Ethan's ear, and managed a small, grateful smile. As the bailiff rose to clear the bench, Susan held her children close, feeling the tremor of relief ripple through her body. In that instant, she understood why Ethan had waited, why he had carried that letter with him until the perfect moment. In a courtroom filled with polished adults wielding polished arguments, it was the quiet courage of a 7-year-old that had turned the tide toward justice. The moment Ethan handed the judge that folded piece of paper, the entire courtroom seemed to draw a collective breath. Inside was a letter from Mr. Miller's own accountant dated 3 months before their divorce filings, outlining a deliberate plan to shield assets and manipulate appearances. With quiet precision, the document recommended transferring funds into offshore shell companies, opening untraceable accounts, and underreporting income on official statements. Its stated goal: ensure minimal legal footing for her to contest custody by projecting fabricated stability and moral uprightness. For decades, Americans have believed our courts uphold fairness, but here, crammed into those antiseptic walls, the scales had been secretly tipped. What struck everyone most wasn't just the cold. Clinical language, it was the betrayal woven into every line. This was a strategy letter, written by someone paid to exploit the system, to rob a mother of her rights and her children's future. As Judge Reynolds unfolded the pages, his expression shifted from guarded skepticism to outright disbelief. He looked at Robert Miller, once a smiling father in family photos, and saw, for the first time, a man willing to sacrifice integrity for control. Ethan's small hand trembled slightly as he watched the judge's eyes scan each sentence. He may have only been 7, but he understood courage and honesty better than most adults in that room in his short life. He'd already learned that love wasn't measured by money, but by truth. Now, in that hushed moment, he held the proof that real stability comes from character, not bank balances. When Judge Reynolds asked Mr. Miller to explain the letter's contents, the elder man could only sit in stunned silence. The polished exhibits and glossy home tour photographs his attorney had brandished moments before suddenly felt hollow. In their place stood a single sheet of paper that pierced every glossy facade with undeniable reality. By the time the judge announced an immediate inquiry into Mr. Miller's finances and suspended his visitation rights pending that review, Susan Miller felt tears sting her eyes, but they weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of vindication, proof that even in a world governed by documents and dollar signs, a child's simple act of truth could restore justice. And for her, that letter was more than evidence. It was a testament to the power of honesty and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children. The courtroom fell deathly silent the instant Judge Reynolds' gavel came down, calling a brief recess until he could parse the shocking new evidence. Susan Miller felt her pulse slam against her ribs as the folded letter, so small and unassuming, had completely upended the narrative. Across the bench, Robert Miller sat rigid, his carefully tailored suit suddenly looking out of place in the harsh fluorescent light. His attorney, Jessica Anderson, flushed with embarrassment, gathered her exhibits but kept shooting desperate glances at the judge. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. The letter now opened on his desk like a window into Mr. Miller's secret plan. He tapped his pen against the paper. His brow furrowed. "Counsel," he said. Addressing Jessica Anderson, this document appears to be a detailed strategy dated 3 months before divorce proceedings began, outlining asset concealment, offshore transfers, and reduced income reporting for the express purpose of gaining an unfair advantage in custody and support decisions. His tone was calm, but the weight of his words crackled through the room. Jessica swallowed. "Your Honor, Please," the judge interrupted. He clasped his hands together and regarded Mr. Miller directly. "Mr. Miller, would you care to explain why you sought to minimize your reported assets and project an image of financial stability at the expense of your former spouse's rights?" Robert's face drained of color. He opened his mouth and closed it again. The pages of glossy financial spreadsheets and glossy photographs of his suburban 4-bedroom house that he'd presented moments before suddenly looked hollow, like props in a stage play. He shifted in his seat, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Judge Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then spoke again. "I find this letter to be a direct attempt to manipulate these proceedings through deception. I am ordering an immediate inquiry by the court-appointed financial investigator into your conduct until that inquiry is complete. Primary physical custody of Ethan and Grace will remain with Ms. Miller, and your parenting time rights are hereby suspended. At once." Murmurs erupted in the gallery, and even the bailiff raised an eyebrow. Susan felt tears spring to her eyes, not of fear, but of relief. She reached out and took Grace's small hand, then Ethan's, holding them both close to anchor herself in that whirlwind of justice suddenly coming back into balance. Outside of legal procedure, it was almost unprecedented. A single piece of paper, carried forward by a brave 7-year-old, had forced the court to pause and reconsider everything. Susan remembered the trembling in Luca No. Ethan's voice when he'd said, "May I show the judge the letter?" She would never forget how he had walked across that marble floor, clutching the folded page as though it were a lifeline. "Now." As the judge banged his gavel again to signal recess, Susan allowed herself a small, shaky smile. The fight wasn't over, but the truth had broken through the shadows of deception. In the hush that followed, she understood that justice doesn't always arrive on time, but when it does, it can sweep away even the most calculated schemes, and it often comes when the most unexpected voice dares to speak. A few days after that dramatic recess, Susan Miller found herself sitting across from court-appointed investigator Marisol Trent in a modest conference room at the county courthouse. The scent of coffee mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead as Marisol flipped through the letter Ethan had handed up to the bench, then turned to the stack of documents Susan had provided. Theirs was a partnership built on painstaking detail and mother's unwavering love. "Ms. Miller," Marisol began, voice measured, "we're going to trace every dollar you earned and every asset Mr. Miller might have moved out of reach." She tapped a file labeled Asset Disclosures and another marked Tax Filings. Susan nodded, her heart still fluttering from relief that truth would finally see the light of day. Over the next hour, they reviewed bank statements showing Robert's unexplained withdrawals, and the trail led first to Nevada. Susan watched as Marisol sketched a timeline on a legal pad, 3-wire transfers of $25,000 each to an account in Reno under the name Desert Holdings, LLC. Followed by smaller payments trickling into a shell corporation incorporated in Delaware. It was an intricate web money siphoned from the joint checking account days before Robert filed for divorce, routed offshore, then funneled back in innocuous-looking transactions labeled consulting fees. They used prepaid debit cards and cashier's checks to avoid leaving an obvious paper trail, Marisol explained, highlighting transactions that each fell just below the $10,000 reporting threshold. He knew exactly what he was doing. Susan's throat tightened as she recognized the pattern Robert had once boasted that his family knew how to protect itself, though she never imagined it meant putting their children at risk. Over the next week, subpoenas went out to banks in Nevada and Delaware. Susan spent evenings hunched over her laptop, logging into the county portal to track the investigators' progress. By the time Marisol reconvened their meeting, she had uncovered 2 more offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, registered under a nominee director's name, as well as multiple cash withdrawals at out-of-state ATMs synchronized with Robert's business trips. Each revelation strengthened Susan's resolve. She recalled nights filling clay-colored buckets with hot water for Ethan's bath and mornings clipping coupons so Grace could have a new winter coat. In those quiet moments, she'd wondered if hard work and sacrifice would ever be enough. Now, armed with clear evidence of deliberate concealment offshore shell companies, nominee accounts, and undeclared income, she felt a surge of vindication. When the formal inquiry report landed on her desk over 30 pages of sworn affidavits, bank ledgers, and forensic accounting analyses, Susan allowed herself a small, triumphant smile. The case against her ex-husband's manipulation was airtight. She printed a copy for her new attorney at the Domestic Support Advocacy Group, then closed her eyes and pictured Ethan's brave stride across the courtroom floor. A week later, at the final hearing, Susan walked in not as a frightened, unrepresented mother, but as a confident woman backed by facts. The judge reviewed Marisol's findings, asked pointed questions of Robert's counsel, and then, with deliberate clarity, granted Susan full physical and legal custody of Ethan and Grace, ordering Robert to pay back child support and restricting his visitation until he complied with monitored guidelines. Leaving the courthouse that day, Susan felt the spring air on her face, tasted freedom in every deep breath. She reached down to hold Grace's mittened hand and smiled at Ethan, remembering how a single, folded letter had ignited a search for truth, and how together they had uncovered a hidden fortune meant to silence them. In the end, justice wasn't just restored, it was redefined by a mother's courage and her son's quiet insistence on honesty. A week into the court-ordered inquiry, Susan Miller sat at her kitchen table, the morning light slanting in through a threadbare curtain as she reviewed the latest report from investigator Marisol Trent. The documents detailed wire transfers of $25,000 each to Desert Holdings LLC in Reno, Nevada, and smaller payments trickling into a Delaware-registered shell company. Further digging unearthed nominee directors in the Cayman Islands and cash withdrawals at out-of-state ATMs that perfectly coincided with Robert's frequent business trips. Each testament, each affidavit, and every bank statement painted the same picture: a deliberate campaign to siphon off marital assets and underreport income in order to sway custody and support decisions. Susan remembered the nights she spent mixing hot water on the stove, 2 gallons at a time, to bathe her daughter, Grace, and the mornings clipping coupons and faded newspapers to stretch grocery dollars. But now, all those small sacrifices felt vindicated by cold, hard evidence, a clear money trail leading directly back to the man who had sought to portray her as unstable and incapable. She could almost hear Judge Reynolds' voice from last Tuesday. emphasizing that asset concealment for the purpose of misleading the court is a serious violation. As she organized the voluminous report into binders for her new attorney, Susan felt a renewed sense of purpose. No longer was she navigating this maze alone. Every offshore account, every prepaid debit card transaction, and every consulting fee label added another brick to her case. The financial investigator's timeline, meticulously plotted on yellow legal pads, showed transfers executed just days before Robert filed for divorce, a calculated effort to leave her with nothing. When the final hearing arrived, Susan walked back into the courtroom with measured steps, wearing the charcoal gray dress she'd saved for this moment and carrying binders that held the unvarnished truth. As Judge Reynolds reviewed Marisol Trent's findings, the polished photo albums and glossy spreadsheets Robert's attorney once brandished felt irrelevant. Instead, the court saw a mother who had sacrificed daily comforts for her children's safety and a spouse who had betrayed that trust for personal gain in that moment. Justice wasn't just restored, it was redefined by perseverance, integrity, and a mother's unwavering love. On the day of the final hearing, Susan Miller arrived at the courthouse with quiet confidence, dressed in a well-pressed navy sheath and sturdy low-heeled pumps she'd saved for this moment. She wasn't alone this time. Beside her sat attorney Carla Jennings from the local family advocacy group, whose calm presence reminded Susan how far she'd come since that first bleak morning. When Judge Reynolds re-entered the room and reviewed investigator Marisol Trent's meticulous report detailing offshore transfers, shell companies in Delaware and Nevada, and buried income that had once tipped the scales, he looked directly at Robert Miller's counsel before making his ruling. Based on the substantial evidence of intentional asset concealment and the mother's proven dedication under dire financial strain, the judge announced, this court awards full physical and legal custody of Ethan and Grace to Ms. Miller. Mr. Miller is ordered to pay backdated child support and will have supervised visitation pending further review. As the gavel fell, relief washed over Susan. Gone were the days she'd feared losing her children to a man who valued control over compassion. In their place was the affirmation that honesty and tenacity could overcome even the most calculated deception. Outside the courtroom, Ethan tugged at her skirt and whispered, "We did it, Mom." Grace reached up to hug her waist. Susan knelt between them, pressing her forehead to theirs, and let the spring sunshine fill her with hope. She knew challenges lay ahead: tight budgets, late nights balancing work and school, but for the first time, she felt rooted in certainty her family was hers to protect, legally and forever. In the months following the custody ruling, Susan Miller discovered that winning in court was only the first step toward reclaiming her life. The crushing fear that had shadowed every decision, the dread that someone might catch on and take Ethan and Grace away, began to ease, replaced by cautious optimism. She continued her meticulous budgeting, clipping coupons with practiced fingers and scouring grocery store flyers for the best deals. But now she did so with a sense of control rather than desperation. Instead of boiling water for 2-gallon baths, she installed an inexpensive low-flow shower head that kept the children warm and saved on her modest utility bills, recognizing how long she'd carried silent shame. Susan enrolled in counseling sessions at the local community center. Sharing her story aloud felt strange at first, admitting the nightly tears behind closed bathroom doors, the nights she'd skipped dinner so her kids wouldn't go hungry, but each week, as she named her struggles, the walls around her heart softened. Her counselor, a retired school teacher named Mrs. Albright, reminded her that survival was not weakness. In fact, Susan learned, True strength often shows itself in the quiet choices we make every day, getting up before dawn to catch the bus, folding laundry by hand, tucking children into bed with a story even when exhaustion threatened to overtake her, bolstered by renewed confidence. Susan accepted a part-time bookkeeping position at a small accounting firm in downtown Meridian. The job paid she $18 per hour, enough to cover rent on her cozy 480-square-foot apartment and give her some breathing room for unexpected expenses. She used her first paycheck to buy a refurbished laptop, enrolling in online courses toward an official bookkeeping certification. Mornings found her poring over spreadsheets with the same intensity she once reserved for courtroom documents. Evenings were spent typing assignments while Grace practiced preschool songs and Ethan sketched roots and trunks in his growing tree drawings. At home, laughter returned to their modest kitchen. Instead of boxed macaroni on paper plates, they shared simple meals, grilled cheese sandwiches with fresh tomato soup, pancakes on Saturday mornings, relishing the ritual of eating together. Grace's teacher called to say her confidence had blossomed. She was no longer the shy preschooler who clung to her mother's leg. Ethan joined the art club at Lincoln Elementary and had his drawing of a mighty oak displayed in the school hallway, proudly pointing it out to his friends. Although Robert Miller made a few half-hearted attempts to contest his supervised visitation schedule, the court's backing of Susan's documented integrity and the financial investigator's report left his motions unsupported. He visited the children 3 times under supervision, then stopped altogether, an absence Susan handled with age-appropriate honesty, explaining simply that their father was not yet ready. Eventually, the questions about why ceased, replaced by new routines: Sunday afternoons at the park, Tuesday night homework sessions, Friday movie nights curled up under a quilt Susan had sewn herself. Over time, Susan came to see that the fight she'd waged in court was mirrored in the everyday battles of parenting, budgeting, and self-care. Yet with each small victory, completing an online course module, adding a few dollars to her savings account, hearing her children's laughter echo through their home, she felt a deeper truth settle in her soul. Resilience is not a one-time victory, but a lifelong practice. And thanks to a brave 7-year-old and a mother's unwavering love, Susan and her family were no longer simply surviving, they were truly, steadily, growing. In the weeks after the final custody order, Susan Miller felt the tight knot of fear inside her begin to loosen. She accepted a part-time bookkeeping role at a nearby firm, earning $18 an hour, which finally covered her $820 rent and modest utility bills without scraping the bottom of her meager savings. With her first paycheck, she bought a refurbished laptop and enrolled in an online bookkeeping certification program, studying evenings once Ethan and Grace were asleep. Home life settled into a comforting rhythm. Monday nights meant folding laundry together while Grace hummed preschool songs. Wednesday afternoons were for baking oatmeal raisin cookies, a treat Susan had once thought too costly, and Saturday mornings brought pancakes and laughter echoing through their cozy 480-square-foot apartment. Susan noticed Grace's confidence bloom. Her teacher, Mrs. Johnson, reported that the little girl now waved goodbye at drop-off instead of clinging to Susan's leg. Ethan, ever the artist, joined the school's art club and proudly displayed his sketch of a strong oak tree, roots and all, on the hallway bulletin board, captioned simply, "Growing." Counseling sessions at the community center helped Susan reclaim her self-worth, reminding her that strength isn't measured by bank statements, but by the love and perseverance that carry a family through hardship. Each week, she added a few dollars to a savings jar and checked off another chapter of her certification course. Though budgeting remained tight cereal for dinner when grocery coupons ran dry, Susan no longer felt trapped by shame. Instead, she found hope in small victories, a completed assignment, a worry-free bedtime story, and the steady heartbeat of a home rebuilt on trust, resilience, and unwavering love. Even when the odds are stacked against us, honesty and kindness can light the way forward. Susan Miller learned that lesson in the most unexpected courtroom of all her own life. She discovered that you don't need deep pockets or glamorous appearances to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is a single, brave act of truth. When her 7-year-old son Ethan quietly handed the judge a folded letter outlining his father's financial deception, he reminded everyone that integrity transcends circumstances. That moment didn't just turn the tide in her custody battle. It reaffirmed a universal truth: real strength comes from staying kind, speaking honestly, and refusing to break, even when the world tells you it's easier to give up. This story shows us that resilience isn't built on grand gestures, but on everyday choices: showing up for loved ones, keeping promises, and defending what's right, no matter how small the audience. If you've ever faced a challenge that seemed insurmountable, remember Susan and Ethan's quiet courage. Let it inspire you to live with integrity and compassion, proving that even the littlest voices can spark real change. Your turn. What small act of honesty or kindness has made a big difference in your life? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear how truth and compassion have shaped your journey. And if you believe in the power of real-life resilience, please subscribe for more uplifting stories that celebrate the quiet heroism in all of us. Your voice matters here.